series. My name is Andrea Allison Putman, and I serve as a board member of the International Relations Council here in Kansas City, Missouri. And we are so glad that you could join us for our programming today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live today or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including many of our upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member. You can visit our website at irckc.org. Around the world, women are transforming how business gets done in sectors from government and foreign policy to the arts and international commerce. Women bring unique experiences and perspectives and value to leadership roles. The International Relations Council is proud to present a 6-week series of insightful conversations with women in positions of global leadership. With their help, we'll explore the opportunities and challenges that female leaders face in the international landscape and the outlooks and insights that have the difference of them and their sectors. We hope you will engage with us today as we hear from women in global leadership journalism. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions around the course of the conversation, including Q&A feature that you can also include at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. We are so grateful for our sponsors who have made today's program possible, the Women in Global Leadership series. In particular, we want to recognize our sponsor, Dr. Karenbeth Zacharias, sustaining series sponsor Stinson, and supporting series sponsors Burns McDonnell, Nicole Gresham Perry, Hallmark, and Husch Blackwell. Thank you so much for our sponsors for finding value in these wonderful conversations. We are also grateful to the sustaining conversation sponsor for today's panel, which is Nielsen. So now, without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our panelists and help us navigate this conversation. Mary Sanchez is a national syndicated columnist with Tribune Content Agency. She's also been a Metro columnist with the Kansas City Star and member of the Star's editorial board. In addition to her years spent reporting on race, class, criminal justice, and educational issues, she's a native of Kansas City. So Mary, thank you so much for being with us today. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate the nice introduction, and frankly, just IRC. I think they do so much in this space, and this is another great example. I love this idea of the series. So with that, let's just start introducing and meeting the rest of our panelists so we can have plenty of time to discuss things. First off, we'd like for you to meet Christina Avila Zessetti. And Christina has had a long, wide-ranging career already within journalism. She was with CNN, she's worked with NBC, she's worked with Telemundo International. And after that, she actually then left those more mainstream fields and went into what's called peace journalism. So she'll be able to explain that a little bit better going on. She's been in that with about 10 years, and she founded her own organization, and we'll have her tell us a little bit more in a bit. And then next, I would like to introduce Vanessa Basile, and she's actually in Germany today, but Vanessa is normally based in Lebanon. And she's also the founder of her own organization. So we'll hear about women in journalism with their entrepreneurial spirit. And it's called the Media Association for Peace. And that's also it's a new form of where things are headed within some strains of journalism. So we'll hear more about that as well. The projects that she tends to work on deal with the role of media just in facilitating peace, conflict transformation, human rights, environmental protection. So other things that you hear about normally, but perhaps just from a little bit different perspective. And then finally, our last panelist will be Daisy Sindelar. Daisy, I have not asked yet, but I think she's in Prague, in Czech Republic. She works with Radio Free Europe and has had many leadership roles as we're speaking about women in global leadership. She's currently the vice president and editor-in-chief, and that's Radio Free Europe with Radio Liberty. And before that, she's had the titles of acting president and a director of Current Time Digital Network. And so we'll be talking about a lot of those things too, just even as, you know, things go all digital and what that means, which is why we're able to present this with women literally from around the world. So with that, I'd love to have everyone just unmute so we can start our conversations. We'll give everyone a minute to go ahead and do that. Christina, we'll get you on unmute. There we go. Can everyone hear? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Why don't, you know, now that we have everyone's faces up on the screen, just for our viewers, Christina, why don't you start off? We'll go within the same order of how I introduced. Tell me a little bit more just about your trajectory of your career, just kind of somewhat fairly basic, a short bio, just so people can hear in your own words a little bit more of who you are.
First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity and this invitation to share this space with great women that I deeply admire. Well, actually, I started my career when I was very young in a little TV channel in Guadalajara, Mexico. And then I jumped to Telemundo, to a very red and yellow TV show called Ocurrió Así. Probably you know it in the United States. Actually, that program does exist today, and it's about sensationalism. I started my career, my international career in journalism, in that kind of journalism, let's say. Then I started to work with CNN and then with NBC, in a time that NBC started with Telemundo, to work with Telemundo too.
Okay.
And I was always feeling that there's something empty in my, I don't know, my research to do really a journalist that really matters for people. For some reason, I started to study culture of peace in Spain many years after that. And I finally found something that for me was totally in the sense that I was searching for to do in journalism. So I left my career in mainstream media to start my own organization of peace journalists, because I discovered that mainstream media that wasn't interested in stories of peace or a different kind of approach in our violent reality. So peace correspondent or corresponsal de paz, born in 2009, and here we are yet today, trying to tell another kind of stories, to have another kind of approach of our violent reality, because we have to accept that we live in a very violent and complex reality, not only in Mexico. Actually, our coverage is not about Mexican reality only, but we try to approach to international stories in order to try that people can inspire in other realities and try peaceful solutions in different places of the world. So here we are in 2021, 11 years after, and I'm so happy. My purchase is not so happy, but in my conscience, I'm really, really, really proud of our work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll talk about some of that, because I think the issues of finances,
Yeah.
they're huge. I will announce it here. I just signed a contract yesterday with PBS. And it's a big deal to me because it does mean a lot more financial stability. I'll just fess up right there. It's amazing. Vanessa, let's go to you next. And tell me just kind of a little bit of, about your journey of where you've ended up in this peace journalism space as well. And we'll want to talk about that, because that is kind of new roles. I think in the US, a lot of what that is, sometimes it is a model here, but sometimes you're also hearing it called solutions journalism. So there's all sorts of things, just as journalism, the whole ecosphere kind of like continues to evolve. But go ahead, Vanessa.
Yeah, well, I studied journalism in university and political sciences, and I started right away to publish articles and to work for different media outlets since I was in university. So I started my journalistic career very early. But then a few years after that, I felt that I need to do more and probably to promote a good type of journalism, because the journalism or the media outlets that I was working for weren't the outlets that I was looking up to, like the kind of journalism that they were practicing. It was always like bias and, not objective and not covering all sides of the story. So I wanted to kind of change the narratives that I was, indirectly part of. And this is how I shifted from being a journalist to working in media development and promoting the concept of peace journalism. I received the training on peace journalism myself in Beirut from Jake Lynch, the pioneer of this concept. And this is how the whole idea, started to develop in my mind more, how I can spread this concept further, how I can let other journalists to get to know what peace journalism is, how we can together change the type of journalism that is being practiced in Lebanon. And also, I am also activist, so I think this is the part of me that also pushed me to kind of initiate this project that later on became an organization, and to spread peace journalism and to train other journalists on it. So, and this is where I am still today, 10 years later. I'm still working on developing my organization even more, and doing more trainings and more workshops, more conferences to promote this concept more, and to encourage journalists to really, especially in conflict zones, to really practice it and to change the narratives of the media.
Okay, thank you. No, yeah, and we'll want to dive in a whole lot deeper into both, even some of the places that you worked at before and some of maybe the issues. One of the things that I'm kind of fascinated by is how women shift their careers as they're run up against certain things. I ended up writing columns, frankly, because when I covered race years ago for the Kansas City Star, there were some issues, some nuances with it that I just felt like it would be easier to say in a column rather in what then was very both sidesism sort of journalism. So that's kind of where I got into opinion writing. As a woman and as a female voice, as someone who's the daughter of an immigrant. My father was from Mexico City. But even that has shifted, because now within US-based journalism, I think we have too much shouting, too much opinion, which is partly one reason why I'm leaning into PBS right now. So it's kind of fascinating to me why women change, why anyone does, but in this space, we're speaking to women's careers. So Daisy, with that said, where are you right now? Are you in Prague or?
Yeah, I am in Prague. You got it right.
Okay. Tell us more about what you do, about Radio Free Europe, and just, your career. Because I think you've held leadership roles, solid leadership roles, probably longer than any of the rest of us.
I don't have the benefit of of some of the women on the panel in terms of growing my own organization. And that's something that is, I'm really impressed by, and kudos to all of you. I have been in journalism for 30 years. I got my start not because I was a student of journalism, but because I was a student of Russian. And I moved to Moscow immediately after graduating from college. And this was around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the first time where it was possible for Americans to travel there fairly freely. And I was fascinated and wanted to go. There were not many job opportunities in Russia at the time, but one of the ways that you could get a job was with an English language newspaper, of which there were several in Russia. So that is, in fact, how I got my start in journalism, by working with the Moscow Times, which perhaps some of you have heard of, and it still exists. It's probably the preeminent English language daily newspaper coming out of Russia. And so that was an extraordinary experience. 90s in Russia was a wild time. The country was just opening wide open, and people were so excited about actually having the opportunity to talk to journalists. So it was a fantastic opportunity to be a street reporter. But from there, I did move very quickly into editing. And since then, I have been more or less in a series of management positions. My heart does lie ultimately with editing. And when I moved to Radio Free Europe about 20 years ago, and since we're talking about the decisions that women make, I'll just say the reason I moved from Moscow, which was an incredibly exciting place to work, to Prague for what constitutes a desk job, was because I had had a baby, and I wanted a little more security, and I wanted a place that I thought was going to be relatively safer for a young child to grow up. Moscow, right around the turn of the millennium, was a pretty crazy place to raise a kid. So since then, I have worked in a variety of positions within Radio Free Europe, and am now head of the news division. And that means that I'm heading up not a central newsroom, as we would tend to think of in a news organization, but really more than 20 different news organizations, because what Radio Free Europe does is it works in countries that don't have a free functioning press of their own, and it provides what we call surrogate journalism. It is a replacement journalism for countries that can't rely on their own state-run media or private media to provide them with objective and fairly reported news and information. So we tend to work in the former Soviet space. That's Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, but also Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, the Balkans, and in some places in Central Europe. So it is a fascinating place to work. I work in the I would say in the minority with Americans. Most of my colleagues are journalists who were born and raised in the countries that they report on. And so it is a fascinating personal experience, but also a very heart-wrenching one, because just you can tell from some of the countries that I've named, we're dealing with extremely difficult countries where human rights are under continuous pressure, and where in some cases, obviously, we're dealing with very extreme issues of pressure on women in particular. So Afghanistan is just a case in point, but it's not limited to places where we have extreme examples of girls not being able to go to school. I'll just name two other examples quickly that have we've reported on recently. In Russia, I don't want to get into political issues, but Russia is having its own form of culture wars when it comes to the abortion issue. Abortions have always been accessible and legal throughout the Soviet period as the dominant form of birth control in Russia and the former Soviet states. Suddenly it has become a very hot button political issue because it can be tied to broader goals of the Kremlin. And then even in other countries, you will see that women are always on the short end of the stick when it comes to the lack of a social safety network. So women are in the main responsible for children, they are responsible for taking care of their parents, and they are very often breadwinners as well. And so in countries where corruption is dominant, where there is not a very secure social safety net or not appropriate taxpayer dollars going towards things like education, food support, and the like, it is always women who are paying the price. So that is a huge reporting issue for us and something that we focus on a daily basis.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm absolutely fascinated. Matter of fact, I think I followed some of your organization links last night because I want to be sure and keep up a little bit better than I have. I just always think a global perspective is so valuable. So I'm actually even wondering, as Daisy was speaking, were some of those same issues or the things that our other two panelists, I mean, Vanessa and Christina, do you find yourself or your organizations focusing on what we traditionally, in some ways you could call women's issues, which even that I kind of want to discuss. Back in the day, it meant just one sort of thing. And now I think that's shifting a bit. So go ahead, either one of you, whoever wants to chime in on that.
Anissa?
Yeah, I mean, in my case, for example, my organization is specialized in enhancing the role of media and peace building, and how we introduce or how we define peace building. I mean, peace is also part of it as a human rights, and women's rights are part of human rights. So we do address this issue from this particular perspective. For example, when we organize trainings on media and the human rights, and we train our journalists on how to report on human rights issues, we always have usually a session and in conferences, panels to discuss women's rights and how media address those rights and address women's issues in general. So we always have either a discussion on that or technical skills. We also try to develop the abilities of our journalists on how to report on these issues, on how to get sources that would support women's voices, and how to get women's voices. I mean, to have some also equality in the voices that we get from the female perspective and from the male perspective. So I think it's really part of what we do, and even at the core of what we do. In my opinion, we cannot separate peace from human rights, and we cannot separate women's rights from human rights. So everything is so interdependent, I would say.
Okay. Do you get much pushback against that now? Or when I hear you say that, I hear, from the US perspective, I hear Hillary Clinton when she said it as Secretary of State. Is it accepted, do you find, that human rights or women's rights or human rights, and it's also interchangeable?
Well, sometimes no. And this is why we're trying to kind of push this idea of women's rights are part of human rights. But I would say that the people who come to these activities are people open for these ideas, and they are open to work for these ideas and promote, these strong messages. So I wouldn't say that I got a lot of resistance when I put this on the table, I would say, especially in formal activities. But maybe on the personal level, in-person discussions, out of the work that my organization does, I think, I would definitely have always had some tension in this conversation related to women's rights and gender issues and all of that. So, yeah. There's always resistance when you talk about women's rights. We live in a patriarchal world, and especially coming from the Middle East, also I do live in a patriarchal society. So definitely I do get some resistance in some ways, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I actually want to hear about that as well, even just, what life is like daily. But Christina, did you want to chime in on just that topic?
Well, actually, living in Mexico is difficult to ignore women issues and gender issues, because we have a long story, and a sad and long story of female violence or violence against women. But in Corresponsal de Paz, we try to configure a unified way to think in human rights, as Vanessa said before, exactly. When you work in peaceful issues, you have also to say about the long and not very known history of women working for peace in all over the world. So we try to approach to these issues, but not making a separation of human rights, because for us, we need to integrate this as human race. Actually, we don't like to think in women but by one side and human rights for another side, or rights in general in other side. We try to integrate our mentality and most of all our hearts and our approach, our daily approach to these issues. So yes, we work in this. We know that we women need to be more in this scene of journalists on human rights or in conflict resolutions, but we try to make equilibrate coverage of these issues.
Okay, thank you. You know, I'm wondering too, like, do you all work with a lot of female journalists? And I wonder particularly, like, you know, Daisy, you know, you've got such a reach into so many different regions. Is part of what you do as a female leader, I mean, this does get a little bit to mentoring, but trying to raise the voices of female journalists, or is that even feasible, or where does that play in to what you do?
Sure, and thank you for that question. It's so important. We have not yet reached what I would call 50-50 representation within the organization where I work. But it is not bad. I would say it is probably around 40-60. And something that pleases me quite a bit is that within management in the news division, there is a very healthy representation of women. And so we have lots of female team leaders in our various language services. It's interesting, I've noticed that in journalism schools, the vast majority of the students are women. Yeah. However, for economic reasons, for reasons of personal risk, and then of course for the invariable family reasons that really force a lot of choices on women, you will see them begin to drop out in larger numbers than I think you would with men necessarily. I think something that is really important that media organizations are starting to take on board is teaching women particular skills and providing them with the tools that they need to protect themselves in terms of their online presence. And so what we have seen, and I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists as well, because I assume that the trend is global, is that women face an entirely different operating environment when they go online. And that is because trolls and harassment are rife. They're rife with everyone, but they become vicious, violent, and sexual in nature, even with very highly esteemed professional female journalists. And so they are chased out of the information space online through harassment, and that creates a dearth of female voices on platforms that normally you would be trying to draw a female audience to. So what I'm most concerned about is losing the female representation in conversations in journalism, and particularly on online platforms. So there are a lot of organizations right now doing fantastic work to teach female journalists how to deal with the issues of trolls and online harassment. And I think increasingly it's these kind of tools that are going to ensure that women's voices continue to be part of the conversation very prominently in the safe spaces that we need to create for very vulnerable female audience members that we want to continue connecting with.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, does someone else want to add in, you know, what's your experience with that? With the trolls, or, I mean, does that drive women's voices out of conversations?
I mean, like what we kind of were observing lately in Lebanon, especially, you know, with the crisis that happened, the financial crisis, and also the political situation, and all of the events that were like really very hard, I would say. The women journalists who were trying to cover the issues and post them online, or even express their own opinions over the political events that were happening, were always like faced by hate speech or bullying. Not because what they're saying is true or not, but just because they are women. So they were being offended and because they are women, and they are facing more hatred because they are women. And this is the gender aspect of how the audience interacts with women journalists, especially online, is really so interesting to analyze, like why women journalists get these kind of reaction from the public, and male journalists in comparison, they do not get that much hatred and bullying. So this is something really very interesting to to kind of take into consideration. And I know that many women journalists have stopped kind of publishing online, especially on social media, I would say, just because of that, just because of the reaction of people that were very offensive because they are women, and they were commenting and saying comments that are really I don't know how to translate them, but just because they are very sexual and very offensive, just because they are women. And this is something also related to self-censorship. So the freedom of expression of women is kind of decreasing because of also how the audience is dealing with them.
Okay. So what can organizations do then? I mean, it's interesting, and I'm not critical of it at all, because I've actually done this in my spaces as a mentor. Daisy, you're talking about how organizations are helping women figure out how to protect themselves. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. But what can organizations do? Because somewhat what this is, it's a function of our global world. I mean, we're all sitting in different countries and can give examples of being threatened with sexual violence. So what can an organization do, given that it's a global issue?
I'll jump in because I do have a thought. The organization that we're working with right now is called the International Women's Media Foundation, and they do provide training for dealing with online harassment. What's important to note here is that it is not only for women journalists, it is also for male journalists, because they should be allies in this regard. And what I really get nervous about, Mary, you asked a very good question, is there such a thing as women's issues? And I think that within organizations, you have to be very cautious about not hiving off content about, by, or for women as though it is something different from the rest of the journalistic output. And by extension, it needs to be every organization needs to be united in the value of protecting space for all voices on all of their journalistic platforms. And that will mean in the short term that a company needs to support not only its female journalists and their safety online, but ensuring that their male colleagues are also united in this effort. It plays a really powerful role if men are also involved in sort of the patrolling of online spaces, sticking up for female journalists who are coming under attack and the like. And so I think that is, it does take a little bit of a corporate mind shift. It's pretty complicated in an organization like mine, where you do have more patriarchal cultures bumping up against slightly more Western cultures. So it's not easily applied across the board with all of the divisions within my company. But we are, at the end of the day, I very much like the phrase peace journalism. In a way, that is what RFERL does too. We are very committed to human rights and to creating an engaged citizenry in all of the countries where we meet. And what engagement means, giving people the tools and the information and the freedom to meaningfully stay in the countries where they are and build their societies to be the very best that they can be. And of course, that involves the role of women, but also the role of men supporting them.
Thank you. Yeah, I wonder really, I mean, it's called different things, and perhaps there's different gradations of how it functions, but the solutions journalism, peace journalism, we used to call it advocacy somewhat, but it's offering a broader context for issues, showing people solutions, frankly, is what I keep turning back to, because one of the things that as a columnist and even just as a reporter, people don't want to be inundated with just the negative. They want a lead way in to help. And I think that's somewhat of what the peace journalism is. What I wonder too is like, as women, are women inherently better at that? Or, you know, what are the stereotypes about women leaders? Or, you know, when you started the peace journalism enterprises, did people go, oh yeah, that's what women do, and kind of push it aside? Or go ahead.
Actually, I still receive this kind of response from my colleagues, in conventional journalism. Not only because I'm a woman, but for me, the most worrying thing is they think about this, they think like this about peace, not about women. It doesn't concern me, but
Okay.
they reject the peaceful approach, the peaceful stories, the peaceful issues in media. So I'm not sure that it's a kind of women issues, the peace. I totally agree with Daisy. More and more we are discovering that patriarchal system sneaks in everything, not only in journalism, but in economy, in the school, in our families. So peaceful approach tries to really make a change in this so wrong mindset that we have, and not only men, also women. That's why I'm so convinced that this kind of journalism can make the difference in the way we see our reality, and the way we see and we think about our inner violence and exterior violence also. So I'm not so worried about being or not being women doing this kind of journalism. I'm most interested in convince people, not only journalists, that this is the kind of narrative that can make a difference for all of us, to have a different kind of approach to each other in our daily relationships, and maybe we can stop our violent relationship that we have today in all over the world.
Okay. Vanessa, I'm wondering, maybe is there an example of some of the projects that you've done that might kind of help the audience understand a little bit better what you mean by like a peace journalism approach, you know, how media could play a role?
Yeah, maybe I should also give some context about Lebanon and why peace journalism is very essential there, and like why we need peace journalism. I mean, Lebanon is an extremely tiny country, but it has a lot of diversity as well, cultural diversity, religious diversity. There's 18 confessions, and when we say confessions, it's like sects, which is a part of two big religions, Christianity and Islam. So we do live, Muslims and Christians together, but we belong to different communities. So there's like, for example, the Sunnis, the Shiites, and many other confessions. And from the Christian side, there's also the Orthodox, the Catholics, the Protestants. So we are 18 confessions living in a very small land with very limited resources. And that was one of the reasons why we were in a civil war for 15 years. So like, the society is extremely diverse, which in my opinion is very beautiful, but at the same time, managing those differences, you know, like have created a lot of conflict over the history of Lebanon. So the population is still not knowing how to accept each other and how to accept the differences and manage them. So the media reality is actually a reflection of this tension in the society and all of these divides. And every sect or confession in Lebanon has its own media outlet, and every sect belongs also or is related to a political party, and this political party owns a media outlet. So you see like those divides, you see them reflected in the media. And this is why like it's so much polarized and very biased, and this is why you don't really know what's really happening. You have to watch like 4 or 5 TV channels to understand the news and the events in Lebanon, because everyone like would describe it from their own perspective and own point of view. And this is why like there's always tension, because also this has negative effects on the people, you know, like when people see one perspective of the story and they react according to what they're watching or what they're reading, and this is not the whole truth that they're getting. So like we are in this cycle of violence, you know, that is kind of supported by the media and sometimes created by the media as well. So when I worked as a journalist, I just did not want to be part of this. Like I did not want to be part of, you know, an actor for conflict and for violence, instead of, you know, being an actor for peace. And this is why I went to actually establish my own organization and try to change, you know, this reality. So what I do in peace journalism is actually try to raise awareness about the importance of changing the media reality and pushing journalists to cover in an unbiased way, because also journalists have a lot of biases. So it's not only the problem of the media institutions that are polarized and funded by the political parties and the confessions, but also the journalists themselves, you know, because they grew up in this atmosphere and in this environment that has always tension and inacceptance of the differences. So in my workshops and trainings, I kind of try to like push journalists to think differently, like out of the box. And the ones who really want to do a change, like start by changing their own perspective and to reflect at least on their own biases and to not let these biases, you know, affect their writing and their reporting. So in the workshop that we do train on conflict sensitive journalism, that's also called peace journalism, and we do train them on how to change the way they report the news, being aware first of the biases that personally they have, the institutions they work at they have, and how, you know, in the small maybe like I would say space that they have in these media outlets, how they can use it fully in order to change the way they report the news. So all the workshops are about actually understanding conflict, like raising awareness and like providing the journalists with techniques and tools to understand conflicts and to know how to report them in a constructive way. So like this is what peace journalism is about. It's about giving peace a chance. So, and this is what we do in our workshops, like encourage journalists to work for this direction.
That's fascinating. You know, I think there's just so many ties here into what is happening with journalism education all around the world. Like I work with Report for America, and you know, I actually wrote a whole curriculum about journalism bias. And what I would want is, you know, all journalists to go through a training early on to recognize class biases is a huge one as well. Everyone always just thinks about race, but gender, class, I mean, everything, religious. And I wonder if journalists were more prepped going in, if some of the ways that journalism has fallen short, it sounds like in all of our careers, if that would have had to have been the case. But now it's like we're in a corrective mode. But it just, I don't know, everything that everyone has said here, I just hear an awful lot of same threads in the US as well. So one of the things I wonder too is who inspired you? Just real quick, I'd like to hear, you know, from everyone. And was it a male? Was it a female? Another journalist? You can literally see people thinking, who is the person that inspired? Christina.
There's so many people. There's so many people. I mean, I can think in my literature teacher when I was at the university. So many people. There's a mix. Maybe an idea of very people mix it. But I admire today people like Vanessa, for example, since I knew about her work in Lebanon, I was like, my eyes were like, wow. And for me, I'm very inspired for people who is trying to make peace even in the worst violence, surrender them. So every time I write a story, for example, in my country about people who's disappearing, or narco issues, and people living in the middle of that horrible reality, but they still stand and trying to live and trying to have hope. I discover new people to admire every day. And I discovered that to tell that kind of stories, to bring them to the media, can change and can inspire others, because the world is plenty of heroes, of daily heroes, in Mexico, in United States, in Georgia, and we have a question from Georgia, in Lebanon. We have heroes that don't appear in media. That's my point with peer journalists. We have to know that kind of stories to start to think in a different way of what we are building as a world, as a human race. So I admire so much people. That's why I'm convinced that we need that media move people to admire people around us.
Oh, to highlight the people that are doing the good work, that are, yeah, I was just scrolling through some of the questions, and one of the things that people are interested in is trainings for general people about bias, which I know in the US there's a lot of conversation and actually huge pushback on that issue. But do you know of any, like, you do trainings though within the peace journalism movement of the general population as well, right? Or is it more instructive to move people along in the way they think about things just by what they consume of your journalism? Are you doing trainings of just the general public for how they?
We try to, but I gave some workshops in Spain, in Colombia, in the United States, in Mexico. But to say the truth, journalists doing the exercise today, they aren't interested in this kind of peace journalism.
But they're not interested?
But no.
Oh, okay.
No. Actually, to do this kind of journalism, my huge work, individually and personally talking, was unlearn much of that I have learned in university or in conventional media.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, we have to unlearn. We have to have another kind of approach of what exactly is journalism. To what we need journalists today, to have to talk about the last attack of narcos, what exactly that builds in me as a receptor. So yeah, my daily work is to unlearn and to try that students don't learn so much the conventional forms to do journalism, and to think differently about their career, their world, and our society.
Yeah.
So it's difficult that journalists in plain exercise can accept that peace and journalists can be mixed.
Coexist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how about, who gets to be a journalist? I mean, do you think more women are going to become reporters, journalists, editors, leaders of news organizations as that model expands of who even gets an entry point? I mean, personally, I think it is going to help, but someone else, go ahead. Either Vanessa,
Daisy.
I can say something about that, because I think, talking about bias training is a great thing, but what is even more effective is what you can implement in practice. And I think that representation is such a huge issue right now. It has been great to see the New York Times and other publications really embrace diversity in hiring, and that automatically will provide any editorial newsroom with the plurality of views that you need to tackle the issue of bias. It's one thing to troop into a room with your HR manager and hear about the things you should be worried about, but it's an entirely different thing to have a bunch of different voices at the table. And I think that's a really exciting change that's taking place right now in journalism. And when it comes to women in particular, something that we've been very mindful of at RFERL is always making sure that we are representing women not only in our staff and in our management, but on the screen and in our journalism. And what we tend to say in shorthand is that women are not only victims, and we are trying to get away from the model where, you know, a woman always leads the story in a portrait of victimhood of some kind. And then once that point is made, you toss her away and go to the male experts to talk about, well, what's the solution? So we really are trying to find women economists, women who are in positions of power, who can speak to these issues very credibly as an expert. Women are, frankly speaking, less forthcoming. They don't put themselves out there. They don't, you know, get their name out and about. And it's very easy to turn to the same Rolodex of male experts time and again. So it really falls to individual organizations. And this is something that we're taking on, to actively seek out female experts who can speak on a variety of different professional issues and not just be the suffering wife, mother, sister, daughter. That story is there, and it's an incredibly important one. But if you're only portraying women as victims, that is how they will continue to be perceived.
I think that is so important. Absolutely. Vanessa, I see you shaking your head. Is there something good in a positive? Did you want to add to that, or what did you think as Daisy was speaking?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, what Daisy said made me think about gender sensitive journalism, because this is also a kind of journalism that we try to encourage through peace journalism, like how journalists can become like more gender sensitive in terms of covering women's issues, but also having some balance in the news sources. Like as Daisy was saying, I mean, there are plenty of female experts in all the fields, but like usually like the journalists, even the female journalists, they tend to talk more with the male experts. Like if they're writing in a piece on economy, for example, or in the environment or whatever, they always like go to the male expert, and they always interview, you know, male experts, while we also have female experts in this field. So why we never hear their names in the news? But like part of being gender sensitive is also like being aware, whether male or female journalists, that we should also like give the voice to these female experts, or I mean, refer to them in our news stories. Like this is one thing. And the other thing, I mean, women's issues are not only about violence and, you know, like harassment and all of that. I mean, for example, the political participation of women is also very important, you know, like, for example, now in Lebanon, we're going to have our elections next year, and we're trying to encourage, for example, more women to present their how to say it, like their candidature, to become like candidates, like for the parliament. And also for the municipalities, I mean, to run for elections and to present themselves as like people who have agenda, who can, you know, do the job, who can become part of the government, who can become MPs, and also encourage people to vote for them. So we want also to increase the credibility of women, because also the population has tendency to, you know, vote for male more than female. So I mean, all of this, I mean, we have to just raise awareness on the importance of gender and the importance of the role of women in all sectors, and being aware also of the power relations, because the power relations is also part of the patriarchal society that we live in. So how to break these, or to shift these relations, the more, you know, we are aware of the inequalities, the more we can have a chance to change them. And many people do not have this awareness, at least where I come from. Like we always have to have this discussion over gender equality, power relations, patriarchal society, even for women. So sometimes we do face resistance from the women themselves. And I remember like a couple of years ago, we had a conference at the panel on how media cover women's issues. And we had like a lot of like women were upset. Like women in the room were upset because we were like talking about, you know, the importance of raising issues in the media, like from the women, and we had like, you know, like opposition from the women in the room. You know, it was so interesting to see that because, you know, awareness has also to be done for the women. You know, so like just to be fair and objective, it's not only like, you know, women being victims or like the male oppressing women. No, I mean, also women, they have to support other women, and they have to also have, you know, confidence in themselves, and also help themselves to, you know, reach like higher positions in all the fields. So like, you know, it's like,
All
I don't know, I feel like it's
Yeah.
we can have a whole session to talk about like gender issues. I mean, not only in journalism.
Sure. No, thank you. I know, I think that kind of, I mean, that wraps up so much of what we were talking about, in that if you speak of a patriarchal society or a patriarchal newsroom or issues within any country and gender, it affects everyone. And of course, you know, women grow up in these systems as well. And I think there's also an awful lot of assumptions that you put a woman in a certain place and magically everything's going to change. And not if the system and the work culture doesn't, which you all have spoken to as well. One of the things, you know, I really just want to thank everyone here. We're kind of running out of time already. The International Women's Media Foundation, one of their slogans is they say, being a woman in journalism has always been a courageous choice. And so what I would say is thank you, all of you, for everything that you've offered, because you are all courageous, wonderful leaders. And I really appreciate your time today. I wish we had more of it. We'll try and maybe figure out how to circle back and do more. I know I will try and stay in contact with everyone. Andrea, would you like to go ahead and close us out?
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. And also thank you so much to our panelists. You know, as we kicked off today, we talked about how impactful this dialogue would be. We anticipated it. And I think the panel really delivered to really create that dialogue and that perspective. So again, thank you to all of you. You are definitely courageous women, really leading us in this arena. So again, thank you to all the individuals that were able to join us today. And also thank you in advance to the folks that will listen in on this session in the future. Again, this is our second installment of the Women in Global Leadership series. Want to continue to express our thanks to the panelists as well as to Mary for her leadership today. We also want to thank again our sponsors. So Dr. Karenbeth Zacharias, sustaining series sponsor Stinson, supporting series sponsor Burns and McDonnell, Nicole, Gresham, Perry, Hallmark, and Husch Blackwell. And also special thank you to our sustaining sponsor, Nielsen. Please continue to visit our website to find out more about the International Relations Council. Our website is irckc.org, so you can learn more about our programs as well as to go ahead and register for a future series on the conversations with women in the leadership. And we do hope that you will consider joining as a member if you're not. We do have a corporation, nonprofit, as well as individual and family memberships. So we hope that you will consider joining. So we look forward to seeing you again soon. We know we're at the top of the hour. So thank you again for joining us today and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you so much. And I hear for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.